It's 2:15 on the dot. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to get themselves, well, if you're English, a cup of tea or some other kind of drink, and to take a short break after that very interesting first panel on sustainability in Ohio cities. So in this session, we're going to move to talking about sustainability in relation to Ohio's farmland. And we're lucky enough to have in our panel three experts on this area and quite different backgrounds, I think. First of all, just working through the panel, we have Ben Brown, who's a colleague of mine in the Department of Agriculture, Environmental and Development Economics, and he essentially works in the areas of farm risk management, grain markets, and applied policy. And many of you probably have seen him at meetings around the state talking about the state of Ohio agriculture, corn prices, soybeans, what's happening in the trade war, the farm bill, etc. The governor refers to him as, oh, you're Mr. Agricultural Ohio. So I'm just going to give you that little pitch there, Ben. Our second speaker, and it's great to have Mark Drews on the panel. Mark is somebody who doesn't talk about farming like people like Ben and I do. He actually is a farmer. He's operates a farm with his family in, I guess, across various counties, and that's northwestern Ohio, I believe, in Wood County, Hancock County, Henry and Putnam counties. And it's really great to have you on the panel today, Mark, to hear your perspective from really right there on the ground in the farming sector. Finally, I'd like to introduce Casey Hoy. Casey is a professor. He holds the Kellogg Endowed Chair in Agricultural Ecosystems Management, and he's the faculty director of the InFact Discovery theme here at the university. Casey knows a lot about food systems, et cetera, so hopefully we'll get his insight maybe later on in our discussion in how the pandemic might be affecting the way we think about food systems, sustainable versus resilient systems here in the state and elsewhere. So without further ado, I'm going to work through the panel in the order that you're on the panel, and we're going to follow Brent's lead. We have a set of questions that we gave the panelists up front. I have a number of other questions that we discussed in a pre-webinar meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, but I've also got a few other questions that have piqued my interest as we've been listening to the other presentations earlier on this morning and this afternoon. So I'm going to start with you, Ben. We've heard a lot of definitions of sustainability from the academic, like Alina, to the practical definitions and the way that, say, somebody working in the city of Columbus thinks about sustainability. Ben, how do you think about this with respect to agriculture and Ohio's farmland?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for taking your time and being with us today. And I'm honored to be asked to be on this panel, and really excited to be a part of this conversation. As Dr. Sheldon mentioned, I do work in the Department of Ag Economics, or AEDE, there on campus, but I do have roots to farming as well. In fact, I'm at my family's farm in western Missouri. I came home for Mother's Day and spending the week here helping Dad in the fields. And so I grew up in an ag background, and I continued to carry that interest in agriculture all the way through school. And now I feel like I have the perfect job for me in terms of being able to work in this industry and then work with Ohio's farms as well. And I get the pleasure of working with Mark every once in a while as well, and that's always enjoyable. When I think about sustainability, and I appreciate the question that was asked, and I look forward to all the discussions. So I'll be brief here in just my opening remarks, but when I think about sustainability, I like the term. I realize that there's a lot of disagreement amongst the definition and how we define it, or it can be defined very broad. But I think for me and how I approach this term and how I approach Ohio's farmland, or just farmland across the country, is thinking more along the lines of resiliency. And I do believe that resiliency is a part of sustainability, from the fact that I think it's a very pragmatic approach to the term. When I visit with Ohio Farms and we lay out their approach to farm management on their operations, in most cases or in many cases, they lay out their mission statement to me as being able to pass on their farm to the next generation in better or equal condition to what they have, preferably better, but they would like to pass that on. So when we think about resiliency, I think it touches all three legs of the stool that was mentioned in our opening panel, or the opening presentations this morning, when we think about economic viability, environmental preservation, and social acceptability. And I think all three of those come into play when we think about Ohio's agriculture land as well. The topic around economic viability is something that arises a lot in our discipline in terms of the approach to how we fund operations and how we look at the ability of flexibility. I think that was the term that was used earlier, was being flexible in this area. And it becomes challenging in economic environments when farms have seen depleted or decreasing working capital. It's a metric that I track here at Ohio State when we look at farms across the state and our ability to track working capital to gross revenue. Normally we consider a ratio of something 2 to 1 to be a ratio that allows farms to meet their debts, pay bills, pay staff, pay management. And right now we continue to decrease down from that. And so that limits our flexibility, if you will, to be able to meet some of these challenges. But I would argue that it is not the ending definition. The last time we had great economic stress on our farms in Ohio and across the country was in the 1980s. And I would just like to say, and I hope this comes up in our policy debate as well, is when we think about conservation policy, both in terms of Ohio and across the country, there's a lot of things that we still use today that have roots to the 1980s. Probably two of the biggest would be the Conservation Reserve Program, when we took land out of, or land that isn't, or is highly erodible, not as fertile, I guess, for production, and it has conservation challenges. When we take that out of production, we pay farmers not to take that out of production. That has roots to the 1985 Farm Bill, but then we also introduced the word compliance, and that's where we have a lot of our compliance issues around farm policy. To generate farm payments, you have to meet two sets of compliances. One being the related to wetlands, where you can't, or you agree not to drain land that had previously been a wetland. And then the other compliance is related to sensitive land and environmentally erodible lands. You have to meet those to get your payments, and that triggers basically out of a societal interest. Society, if they're going to be using taxpayers for that purpose, it must meet that interest. So I'll just finish my comments, I guess, just real quick, saying that I think all these play into the definition of sustainability on Ohio's farmlands. But the challenge that I would offer up to it today is, can we expand conservation outside of just compliance and start blending conservation in with our private and revenue risk management policies? When we think of government policies and federal policies, we have three separate agencies that handle the three main programs that are available to farmers, whether that's crop insurance, authorized through the Risk Management Agency, government income support offered through the Farm Service Agency, or the conservation programs like EQIP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, or the Conservation Reserve. How do we make those more a picture of our risk management that then feeds into the viability of farms and being able to pass those operations on to the next generation, the generation after that, and the generation after that? And with that, I look forward to questions, and I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. I like the way you ended there, because that's going to allow me to bring up the question of farm policy and agricultural policy, and get you to think about. I'll get you to think about that now as we listen to what the other panelists have to say. So, Mark, you're working there on the ground. You're a farmer. How do you think about sustainability?
Well, probably quite differently than many of the panelists that's been on here today, because quite frankly, I have never walked into a farm conversation yet, whether it's at the local watering hole or the local boys basketball game or at church, where there's been a group of farmers sitting around talking about sustainability. And it's a topic that has been very undefinable to us. We've struggled with it as a group, as an aggregate. And I think it's because it's such a wide-ranging bunch of theories and things that have been very just oblique to us, that we do not talk about it. But that being said, when my feet are held to the fire like they are right now to talk about sustainability on my farm, it's very easily talked about, because when it all boils down, sustainability to me is the harmony that I can achieve, or the balance that we can attain here on our farm between apparently this has been talked about already, the economics of agriculture, the agronomics of agriculture, the ecology, the land, soil, and water that we work with, and the newest twist to sustainability has been the societal pressures put on farmers. And I think that's part of the reason that farmers are a little bit wary of the talk of sustainability, because we're now seeing groups such as today that it's a whole topic, and it's unfamiliar to us, and we're wondering what the motivation is behind it. We are a little bit, we're very traditional, and when things are non-traditionally talked about and it affects our business, it bothers us a little bit. But when you really look at it, and I think we talk to farmers on a personal level, so many of us are already in that sustainable mode, and we don't know it because we haven't talked about it. So I'm learning a lot today. I wish I could have been a little bit more in tune with what's happened earlier in the day. May 12th is not a perfect time for a farmer on a sustainability conference, but I'm making it work. So please forgive me if this is things that, if I'm redundant or we're talking about things that we already have, but you're going to hear from a farmer's perspective from me today. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. And we'd really appreciate the fact you've taken time out from a very important time of year, and remembering what it was like last year with all the rain we had. I'm sure you're anxious to make sure you can get ahead and plant stuff this year and maybe do a bit better than you did last year. Let's move on to Casey. I forgot to mention that, Casey, you're a professor in the Department of is it horticulture, is that right?
No, entomology.
Entomology, I apologize.
Bugs.
And you're based up at the Worcester campus.
Yes, I am.
We like your backdrop there. So Casey, tell us what you think sustainability is.
Thank you. The backdrop is Brian Gwynn's dad's farm and a project we had there several years ago. That's actually edamame in the middle, which is soybeans, but the kind that you eat straight. I've heard the same kind of things that have been mentioned before, that there's a lot of definitions out there of sustainability, but I hear consistency. When I look across those definitions, it's the balance between economic, environmental, and social dimensions. So, occasionally I hear folks talking about, well, economic sustainability or environmental sustainability or social sustainability, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because the definition I see, if you're not including all three, you're not really talking about sustainability. And then the other side of the definition that's consistent is we're talking about generational timescales. So future generations and like several future generations, which means that we don't really know. We'd have to ask our great grandchildren when they're old enough to really be thinking about what we did and whether or not it was sustainable. So we can't really know whether anything we're doing right now is sustainable. It'll take that long to find out. But we can think about it as a concept, which, as Mark points out, is a little more common in universities than at the watering hole. But I think as something that's practical and down to earth, we can measure things that are changing, as Alina Irwin pointed out this morning, and look at the direction that they're changing. And is that, if that continues, are we going to be able to keep doing what we're doing now? So there are those kinds of questions that we can ask and answer. I think for me, when it comes down to earth, in talking with Mark's neighbors or farmers out there, it is practical questions. So, are your kids going into farming? And quite often I hear, they don't really want any part of that. We've got two very different examples here. Mark's farming with his son. Ben's was out helping his parents last night. So yeah, if the kids are going into farming, now I've got some confidence that on the social side, there's a continuation here. Is what you're finding under the rocks in the creeks, the number of salamanders, the same as when you were a kid, or is that changing? So those are the kind of things that, kind of just practical day-to-day things that you can observe and have some idea. And since Ben mentioned resilience, I'll also throw out another way that I tend to think about these things, and that is in terms of the health of agricultural ecosystems. That's kind of in the title of our program, but agricultural ecosystems include both the farms and neighboring farms and the neighboring communities. So if we think about health at that scale, it's been defined in 4 properties: productivity and sustainability and resilience, which is a bit different in the way it's defined here than sustainability. It's more the ability to adapt when you have a very significant change in the environment. And that's something that's, I think, relative now under COVID-19. And then finally, equity, which these topics have been said. So the resilience part depends a lot on diversity as the kind of grist for adaptation. If the environment changes quickly, you need to be able to adapt, and it's diversity that gives you an ability to adapt. So that a little bit more related to resilience. On the equity side, we have right now before COVID-19, 1 in 7 families in Ohio struggling to keep a healthy diet on the table. So we know we already don't have a particularly equitable system of food access to a healthy diet in Ohio, and that is getting worse with COVID. So those are some of the ways that I think about it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Casey. I guess we've had 3 panelists this morning with very different, well, not very different, but different versions of the definitions of sustainability, and I just heard 3 further additions to that. I'm not saying that I'm confused, but I guess it sort of speaks to the breadth of this topic, depending upon whether you're working on a farm, or you're thinking at this at a high level, like Alina and Casey do, or the way Ben thinks about it from a policy perspective. So let me ask the next broad question, and we'll go through the panel again in the same order. So what sorts of factors do you think are, well, depending on your definition of sustainability, what factors are inhibiting sustainability at either at the level of the farm or the level of the agricultural sector, be it in Ohio or even broader than that? So Ben.
Yeah, this is another excellent question, and I'll refer back to something I said in my opening remarks to kind of expand a little bit further on. When I think about factors that create, or inhibit sustainability at a farm level, I think one of the challenges that we experience, and I mentioned prior, is the ability of cash on hand or working capital. We talk a lot about, and academics love to talk about, debt to asset ratios, and are we experiencing financial stress in relation to the amount of debt we hold, right? And there's no doubt that debt hasn't increased over the last 5 to 10 years, and even more so over a bigger period of time. But I think sometimes what gets lost in that is the rapid increase in equity, or in most cases land, right? When we think about our growth and the value of land and the net worth that's held within farms. And so sometimes I think debt to assets ratio, while it's important, it hides some of the message in terms of the ability to be flexible. And I'll go back to that word earlier, because I thought that was something that came up that I really, really enjoyed in earlier talks, was the ability to be flexible. And we struggle with that, right? And you hear that from the farm level in terms of, well, the first challenge is, I'm not even, as a farmer, a lot of our farms are now expressing to me that not even being able to cover variable cost with our current cash prices, right? $3 corn and $7.90 soybeans, right? When you start looking, down the road and you start thinking a year out, the ability to be profitable just to even cover variable costs becomes challenging. I add that up over a sector, a complete sector, and you add conservation metrics on top of that, whether that's cover crops, whether that's any type of conservation practice that might be thrown out there as kind of the new key thing, right? And I'm not poking fun at that, but if you look over the last 5 years, there's been even longer. No-till for a long time in Ohio was a key practice, right? Now it's it's been cover crops, and it'll continue to change, right? Whatever that new key definition is, right? Farmers have to be flexible have that flexibility within their financial cushion to be able to maneuver there and take that on, right? The second thing that, again, I'll kind of piggyback a little bit on something that was said earlier, but I think it was really important, was how we've grown operations. And I mentioned being able to pass down an operation to the next farm. You look at real prices of food, whether that's corn, soybeans, any commodity, right? And the only way to be able to grow your operation to either bring on the next generation or to finance, even that operation long-term, was to continue to grow acres. And the way we've done that, even in the era of changing weather or changing climate, right, to where we now have a shorter planting season, 2019 was a prime example of this, is to get bigger of equipment. And when you get 2 days of weather, and I'm looking at Mark, because Mark, I don't even know if you had 2 days of weather last year, right? But those 2 days, you hit the ground running and you plant as much as you can in those 2 days, right? And that becomes challenging when you have labor issues, right? And so the way we've corrected for that is bigger equipment. And that limits where we're able to put crops and our ability to farm certain land. I will say, though, that I think the integration of technology is starting to catch up with us a little bit in that area. I think you're going to continue to see, or let me put it this way, I think we're almost reaching a plateau. If I was to, and I talk with our ag engineers about this, a plateau in terms of equipment size, where the future generation might be looking at smaller, more autonomous tractors, right? To where the limiting factor is no longer labor or time, but it's now capital, right? And that flexibility within that. So I think that's another limiting factor. And then the third thing, if I can bring in a social aspect a little bit, is there's a great book. It's one of my favorite books I've ever read, and it was written by Howard Buffett, and it references the 40 chances a farmer has to plant a field. And the idea is that between the time you take over a farm from your parents or whoever, right? You have 40 chances before you pass that on to your next to the next generation, or 40 crops. That's not a lot of chances when you think. We think in terms of years, right? But you break that down into crops, and all of a sudden now you don't have a lot of opportunities to make something work. And so farmers have to be convinced that a practice is going to work. They have to see it and almost feel it, right? And this is where I think demonstration farms, the opportunity for farmers to get out and see something work and almost be convinced of it is so critically important, because now all of a sudden we've got, if we take the economics off the page, if we take the flexibility off the page, they now have to see somebody else being able to do it in a lot of cases before they jump in. And I think that's limiting to some extent too, because we just don't have a lot of those opportunities. In some ways, they're very new. And so we'll continue to see those grow, I think, and that'll be something that helps with sustainability at the farm level as well. And with that, I'll stop.
Mark.
Well, Ben, you did a great job of covering the economic portion of it, because obviously that's always on the front burner of what a farmer's thinking about. And particularly in these trying times of sub $3 corn and sub $8 soybeans, it becomes almost the driving force. But since you've covered that so well, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. And it's one of the factors that I feel really inhibit sustainability on a farm is the traditions that we have. It's very obvious that to be sustainable, we have multi-generations, as Casey talked about, and there are trade secrets, if you will, that are passed down from generation to generation. My great-grandfather and my grandfather to my dad to me to my son and my grandchildren. And those, traditions help us sustain our farms, to keep them going. but they can also inhibit new thoughts and ways to do things. And what we find, the position I find myself in here at this time is that science is the only thing that's going to trump those traditions. And if you prove it to me through scientific study, traditions are slow to break, but they can be broken. And cover crops is a great example of that. I mean, since we're on that topic a little bit, I mean, something that really wasn't thought about implicitly here until recently. That's something that we hadn't done traditionally, but we've seen some things happen through science that has led us to try those and to experiment a little bit. The same thing, another example of that is soluble phosphorus. I was told traditionally for years, even through the academia, through Ohio State, who we fully trust, that there was no soluble phosphorus. We have found out differently through science recently. And so traditions are hard to break, but they can be broken. But along that phosphorus line is the second thing that I see a little bit of them. I'm a little bit concerned of, and that is some denial of facts. And I think it's a very small segment of farmers. And I'm not real proud of it, but I think there are some farms that deny science, that they are saying it is not our problem. And again, it's a very small segment, but we have to somehow have relationships to bridge that they trust science, and that we can change the sustainability or the thoughts of sustainability on those type of farms. So the traditions and the denial of facts are two things other than economics that I see as part of the problem.
Thank you, Mark. Casey.
Both great answers. And Mark, I think the denial of science is something that we struggle with across society. That farmers are not alone on that one.
True.
I guess I would put it as inertia, and it ties into, I think, both answers and the kind of flexibility that Ben talked about, and kind of hanging on traditions that Mark talked about. And, you know, there are a number of things that are just guaranteed to change. And especially on generational timescales, technology, culture, the kind of farming practices, governments and policies, and the role of governments in farming. All of these things are guaranteed to change over time. What I see inertia in is going a particular route. For example, the control of the amount that we spend on food staying low while Mark's costs keep going up to produce, which kind of pushes the specialization and lack of flexibility that Ben talks about. And I get concerned about sustainability of a system that farmers don't have much control or flexibility over. So we have a lot of work on how to accomplish that expansion. I don't see a whole lot on how to go back the other way, take a different turn, take a different option. So I think that's where we could look for opportunities that would create greater diversity, that would contribute to resilience, as well as more flexibility that allows those things that are going to change in ways that keep the farm and the enterprise and the values that we get from it going through the generations.
Thanks, Casey. I'm just going to throw in a question here, or I'm going to synthesize a couple of questions from the audience. One is from Alina, and I think this kind of goes to the heart of a lot of the things we've been talking about this morning, and I know generally I hear a lot of discussion about this. So Alina raises a really interesting point, and I'm kind of pushing this question at Ben and Mark. So you've talked about the financial sustainability and resilience of an individual farming unit as one way of thinking about sustainability in the agricultural sector. But that, I think there's this tension then between that sort of notion of sustainability, which is one part of this three-legged stool that we've repeatedly heard about this morning, versus the broader issue that there are these bigger trade-offs between sustainability of the environment and economic outcomes. And I guess the question here is that really a tension, or is it a tension that's really hard to get away from? And then sort of following up from that is that subject to the individual farm level economic sustainability resilience issues, if farmers do recognize, and many of them do, and listening to Mark, it's obvious that they recognize issues relating to soil use and water issues, et cetera, and wanting to pass on a farm to the next generation that will be sustainable both economically and from a broader environmental standpoint. But Tim Harbour, my department chair, asks a very interesting question, which is many of the benefits of farmers thinking about sustainability and acting on sustainability in this broader context, they bear all the costs, but the benefits go to broader society. And so there's two questions there. There's tension between individual farm level resilience and the broader environmental issue. And then if farmers do take actions, they bear all the costs and don't get maybe all of the benefits. I think it would be unfair to say you don't get any of the benefits, but you don't necessarily get all the benefits. So there's sort of a collective action problem here. So Ben or Mark, who'd like to go first on this one? And Casey can throw in his thoughts in a minute too. Mark, can I ask you how you, oh, Ben, you're ready.
Nope, well, that's all right. I was gonna jump in, I guess. So to the first question, and I realize there's actually probably a series of questions here related to this. No, I would not disagree, to be honest with you, in relation to the economic trade-offs along with the environmental trade-offs. I don't, in fact, I agree fully that they're there, that those trade-offs exist. I think the point I was trying to raise, and maybe I didn't raise it as well as I should have, is when we look at, or when I talk to farms at a farm level, their number one goal is to create an operation that can continue to exist, and I think that exists on all three levels. And from the economic standpoint, obviously the business has to exist, to be profitable, to make money, to expand, and to continue to grow, or other just inflation and other causes are going to continue to shrink the business, if you will. The environmental component of that is, if we continue to strain, the natural resources that exist for that farm, eventually the cost will continue to go up, right? And we've seen challenges with that in Ohio, and I would argue that one of the challenges before many of the environmental policies that are talked about is even the changing structure of farms. More and more cash rent away from land that's owned, and more short-term leases. When you start talking about a 1-year lease versus a 5-year lease versus owning land for 30 years, that changes the conversation around what you're eligible or what you're willing to do as a farmer or as a producer, right? And so I think there is some challenges that are there in relation to just the farm structures and the natural change that's happening there, that's presenting new challenges, if you will, or struggles. But then back to this environmental component, right? If you aren't paying attention to that from a local level and a single operational level, eventually those costs continue to go up, and you bear those and those play out. Plus, then you're causing that externality on the society around you, or the society as a whole. So yes, I do think there are trade-offs, and I think this goes into then to Dr. Hab's question. But and just finally, I bring in the societal part, not necessarily just thinking about the societal pressures that Mark's mentioned that are placed on the ag industry, but I also put family society into this equation as well. I'm certainly not a farm counselor by any means, working with farm families. I don't tend to play in that role. I personally, I don't want to be in that space. I don't know many people that do. But you start seeing some of these generational debates break out on the families, and this is how we get operations that have to get sold at the auction block, and no longer are those farms then viable to move on to the next generation in the same form they did, right? And now all of a sudden that mission statement of that operation is going. So maybe I'm missing the question altogether from what Dr. Irwin was asking, but I would just raise the thought that no, I actually fully agree in that case that there are these trade-offs. The question becomes, how do you do that? Now, let me answer Dr. Hatt's question, then I'll stop. I talk too much and ramble, but in relation to the societal benefits and the localized cost, you know, if I'm being true to myself and true to my markets, you know, we can price this sometimes into product diversification through attributes, and I think we've seen this, right, through certificate programs. When I look at H2 Ohio that was mentioned earlier, one of the core pieces of that program is farmers have to get certified within the program to receive funds. We've seen this in other attributes of products, whether that's organic, whether that's certified all natural, you know, what have you, right? There's certifications that go along with that, and if society values those, and again, maybe I'm missing a point here or a message, but if they do value those, then they'd be willing to pay more for those attributes. And the traceability becomes very important, making sure that we're not seeing fraud enter those markets to where something that's not meeting that attribute then is getting paid a higher amount than what it should. So that would be my responses to that series of questions, and I'll let Mark answer.
Yeah, Mark, just quickly, I work in the space of thinking about
very, very quickly. When we talk about the economic versus environmental, you know, trade-offs, I think that is the crux of the issue of sustainability from my perspective down here on the farm. If one of the three or four, you know, it's talked about as a three-legged stool, I kind of look at it as a three or a four-legged stool. If one of those is out of proportion, it is always brought back into proportion, either through regulation, economics, or some other component. They are very seldom, if ever, taken to the point of being so far out of proportion that if it does, it destroys the farm. For instance, if you're a bad actor in agriculture with let's say fertility, and you're applying way too much phosphorus, which is really crazy agronomically and economically, but if you are, eventually you're going to be taken care of through regulation and or societal pressures, those type of things. So that is the crux of the problem. But I think that they all are self-policing to a point. Okay. And the last point, real quickly, I'm so glad to hear that somebody is talking about societal benefits versus localized cost. I have contended from day one, when we start seeing the problem up here in the Western Lake Erie Basin, that it is a societal problem much more so than it is a agricultural problem. Everybody in the basin they flush their toilets. Okay. We are adding phosphorus to the lake at all times. And we're doing things that, you know, the lake has morphed into what it is. We've already saved the lake once in my lifetime, back in the 80s, by conservation tillage. We took out the sedimentary phosphorus and the sediment out of the lake. What we did was create another whole set of problems that we did not realize at the time. Mother Nature is much smarter than we are. She changed that lake into something that was much clearer, more productive for fishermen and recreation. And now we have another issue. And so it is definitely a problem to balance that. And I feel truly that if you want the lake to improve and you live in the Western Lake Erie Basin, you have to contribute yourself, not just agriculture.
Thanks, Mark. Casey, how do you think about these two questions?
Yeah, I guess I think of the trade-offs as a symptom of a system, first of all. And that is one of those examples where, I mean, if you do have a trade-off, and I think as Ben said, if the push is to expand, then you can very quickly get into kind of an economic dimension override, where that becomes the primary consideration. You have to take care of that first, and then the other two dimensions become a bit secondary. And I do hear that, I see that. I think it's part and parcel of what we as a society place on farmers, the kind of responsibilities that we place on them. I will say that the farmers that I've met and talked to who have embraced the benefits that could be considered to be more off-farm, more for society than themselves, and worked at including them as benefits either direct to the farm on the environmental, social relationships with neighbors, improvement of environmental quality on the farm as a direct benefit to the farm, or an indirect as it wraps back around through the social benefits that they create, are finding success with that approach, and the kind of flexibility and a way of achieving the flexibility that we talked about earlier.
Thanks, Casey. I'm as a policy guy, I'm going to switch the tenor of the conversation to public policy now, and we're going to start at the level of the state, and then we'll work our way up to federal and maybe international policy. But we had a very good question actually from Brian Gwynn. I'm going to try to synthesize his question. So if we were thinking about a strategy for sustainability for Ohio agriculture, he makes a really interesting, or asks a very interesting question, which is, how do we achieve a cohesive strategy at the state level when our state is so diverse? And he makes this really interesting dichotomy between northwest of 71 and 30. I guess that's up in your part of the world, Mark. The issue is one of nutrient management, whereas if you're northeast of Interstate 71 and US 30, the issue is this, what we talked about this morning, which was the rural urban interface and the effect that that has on land prices. So who would like to have a go at that first? What do we need to have a cohesive, maybe coherent strategy towards sustainable agriculture within the state? Ben.
Yeah. So, I'll just go back to, I think, what the keynote speakers mentioned earlier today. I think they laid out unique but manageable strategies for this, where there's goals in aggregate, policy, whether that's through cap and trade or what have you, to an aggregate. Now the question about how do we manage that across the state, Brian brings up a really great point, and I've witnessed this in the 2.5 years I've lived in Ohio. I would put Ohio very much in the same category as I would put Missouri. There's broad changes across the state landscape and very different approaches to how you handle sustainability, or even the issues that exist, right? So how do you manage that on a state basis? And that's a really good question. I don't know if I have a great answer, to be perfectly honest. I think the aggregate proposals, right, that were mentioned this morning in terms of an aggregate goal to work towards, and then targeting those at the policies or the parts of the sector within Ohio that is most related to those, I think makes sense. Again, I'd have to probably think about that and work that through some analysis, but again, you're not going to target the same type of sustainability in Northwest Ohio as what you would, or Southeast Ohio. And I think that's why this program was set up in a way, the way it was, with the 3 forms of landscapes between forest, cropland, and then urban areas. So that's a really great question. I don't know if I have a great answer for this, but I think you got to target it in a way that makes most sense to the region of the state that's the closest in relation to the issue. I'll let the other panelists take a stab at it.
Mark.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think flexibility is key here. I mean, that's a great question for the fact that Ohio is such a diverse state, but what state isn't? I mean, Michigan, Ben mentioned Missouri. I mean, we all have our own individual strengths and weaknesses. That's what I thought was so great about the H2 Ohio program, was the fact that it was targeted to 14 counties up here in Northwest Ohio that have one very specific goal, and that is to reduce the phosphorus in Lake Erie. And they came up with a what I feel is very workable plan. I'd like to thank the Director Polanda and Governor DeWine for going down that path, because it was for the first time I shouldn't say that. I should say very rarely do we have a government program that I think most participants felt was very fair and well thought out and was workable. And so H2 Ohio is a what I was very proud of Ohio that from a policy standpoint, I think we were breaking ground, that we were addressing a problem in a very sensible manner with a program that would incentivize practices that promoted sustainability. I mean, it wasn't just water quality, it was sustainability. And so we were on the right track. But unfortunately, the last 2 months, we've had to reshuffle the deck and the priorities have changed. And it remains to be seen where water quality and therefore sustainability will come out in the cards. So, but that was a great policy incentive or initiative, I should say, by Ohio.
Casey?
Yeah, I would say, one of the things that is a bit unique about Ohio is the kind of uniform distribution of cities ringed by rural land. So that was alluded to earlier, the prevalence of the rural-urban interface in Ohio. We have a history and a tradition, if you will, of being pretty focused on export for our agriculture. And yet we have this very large population and very close at hand to our farms. So I think that's something that we don't necessarily take advantage of quite enough. I guess if I think about policy at the state level, there are kind of three things. I get my preferences for incentives and investment. And I think most people prefer that kind of thing. It's on the positive side. The Council of Development Finance Agencies has had a recent series of publications on finance for food systems. And their point is, we have development finance for water, for energy, for all this infrastructure that is critical to society. Why wouldn't we do that for agriculture and food? So I think that makes a lot of sense, is to turn our development finance agency investment possibilities over to food and agriculture. Another thing that I would think about is scale independence. So, getting at that flexibility question, to what extent are policies supporting farms of all sizes and scales? And this is a partial answer to Brian's question. But yes, we do have an extremely diverse agriculture in Ohio. So to what extent can you create policies that really works regardless of scale? It's not an easy ask, but it's certainly a consideration. And then finally, kind of in that same vein, provide equal access and support for internal as well as export markets in the work that we do. And I think there is, very strong focus on export. I think there can be an equal focus on internal markets, and that helps with creating opportunities for everyone as well.
Thanks, Casey. Lots of questions have been flooding in as you guys have been talking. So I'm going to try to cherry pick a few here. I think Casey and Mark, you partially answered this question from David Beekman. What's the best way to convince farmers to try new management techniques? I'm going to put out a bunch of these questions to see if you can answer some multiple questions. Back to Alina, and I guess this ties back in what you were just saying, Casey. Yeah, we got to give farmers incentives for adopting ecosystems and generating the benefits that those systems will lead to. How do you generate the revenues to make those payments? I would just stick in an aside here. European farm policy has definitely gone in this direction of paying farmers to generate environmental externalities, use of agricultural land for, recreational benefits, et cetera, a switch away from, support prices, et cetera. Where does organic agriculture fit into all of this? I think that's the first time we've heard the mention of organic agriculture today. There is Alan Lyons just threw in a question about the H2O program. He has exactly the same question. Where will the funds come from to implement this across the board? So I guess, how do you get farmers to do it? How do you pay for it if you give them incentives? And where do other agricultural production systems like organic fit into a sustainable or higher agriculture? So quick answers from all three of you, because I want to round out with a question for all of you about the implications of the pandemic for sustainability. Ben?
Yep, I'll jump in here. And thanks for the questions. And I'm going to try to do my best to say this in as short and concise way as I possibly can. But, you know, in my opening remarks, I challenged us to think about bringing together some of the risk management policies, whether that's price risk, whether that's income risk, into the equation, and talk about conservation and sustainability and those methods. And I think the answer to the question related to how do we encourage this is really in that fold, right? We are at a point where about 30% of farm income, and most of my farms do not like me to say this, but 30% of our farm income comes from some form of government support, whether that's in price support, what have you, right? If you start adding in more compliance or stricter compliance into this, to where there's the ability to follow some practice, you know, that you're then generated, or that's what generates your income, you know, right? Your portion of the income that comes from that. And if we are all in agreement that we're that tight on margins, you know, then folks will have to follow along, right? If they aren't receiving that assistance, then they eventually will suffer financial collapse or be incentivized out of the market, right? I think that's a challenge. And Dr. Sheldon, you mentioned that in terms of that's the direction that the EU has gone. And I think we're on that path here in the United States as well. As far as organics, how does that fit into the picture? One of the interesting things that, you know, I always find in organics is when people talk about organic agriculture, a lot of times they also talk about it in the form of small scale agriculture, where they're associating those two things together. And I would push back a little bit on that and say that the evidence that we've seen is that organic agriculture is in a lot of cases much bigger than our conventional agriculture, especially if you look at where it is and where it falls. You're looking at very broad scale, big operations. And so I think it is there. It is certainly a certification program. If people are willing to pay for that sort of attribute, you know, it does exist, and there is a compliance and authorizing process that goes along with that. So I think it does fit into the picture as well. The question is, and sometimes people are surprised when I show them the results in terms of how organic fits into the size categories, you know, that they're surprised that organic operations are as large nationwide as what they are. So I guess would be my comment there is those two things aren't mutually exclusive. And especially when we start talking about the size differential that Dr. Hoy mentioned, it becomes very contentious of a topic. It was a 60 Minutes topic just a week and a half ago. And so I think it's something that will continue to be a topic of farm sale, and how big should farms actually be.
Mark?
Yeah, very briefly, on how to implement these management changes on a farm. Because of the constraints of economics right now, I'm going to say this very bluntly. Don't expect me to try to implement management changes that are going to benefit society on my dime. Let's do this in a way that's where the universities and everybody can come and work together. Private industries also. To prove this stuff to me scientifically that it will work agronomically, that it will work. That's where OARDC or somebody would come into play. And again, private business has to be part of that too. That they all help implement those changes so that we can see it somewhere else first, and then we will do it. That change is not going to come from the farm until we can prove that it's going to be viable on our farm. The organic portion, I don't see where that's exclusive at all. I don't see why they can't be as big of a part of this as anybody else. I work very closely with an organic farm neighbor that, you know, he can benefit from a lot of this stuff too. They can, and it can be done. I don't have time to go into the specifics. And then Alan Lyons' question, That's $1 million question. Dr. Lyons, is where's that funds coming from? Good question.
Casey?
Sure. Organic, I'm glad Mark mentioned that. I think it's both a pathway and a potential route to both flexibility and the changes in practice. So for example, the farmers that rent the Mellinger farm from OARDC here in Worcester have been farming about 2,500 acres from New Philadelphia all the way over to Delaware. They started doing organic hay because they realized they could make a little bit more on it, and they are now about 80% organic and figuring that they are going to reduce down to about 2,000 acres and figure they'll make just as much and free up 500 acres for other farmers. So I think that is that's a valuable route to flexibility and new opportunities. As far as the who pays question, I think you do have to look at the benefits, and it is a benefit that coming back to all of us. There's been a lot said about the difference in what we pay for food versus healthcare and how that's exactly reversed in a lot of other countries. People in other countries pay a lot more for food, but a lot less for healthcare, and there's a relationship there. I mean, this brings us back to COVID. The people that are really suffering are the people that have been in food insecure and suffering from diet-related diseases are much more susceptible, and that's expensive. So we do all pay for it anyway. We're going to pay either now or shove the cost down the road. So I guess the question back would be, what do you think you owe your great-grandchildren?
Yeah, I just want to jump on a point there that you just made, Casey, about what consumers pay for food. This is drawing on a comment from one of my colleagues, Wu Yang Hu, who spends a lot of his time thinking about what consumers are willing to pay for different attributes for food products. And I think somebody mentioned this earlier on the panel, and it's something I thought about a lot. And my brother, if he were on the panel, would wax lyrical about this. My brother was a large-scale hog farmer in the UK. And I don't know if you know, in the UK, we have some of the tightest animal welfare regulations in Europe. And my brother would say, I'm happy to have the happiest hogs on the planet, but as long as consumers are willing to pay for the price in the packet of bacon they buy in the supermarket, I'll do it. And I think that's a really important point that Wu Yang raises. We've talked a lot about producers, we've talked a lot about government, and I'm implicitly, we've talked about people who put pressure on people like Mark on their farming practices. But at the end of the day, all of these costs should be passed through to the consumer, who should be willing to pay for it if they're demanding it. And I guess if you're willing to pay 50-cent premium or whatever it is for organic foods, then why does that not cut across, cleaner water runoff from your farm to happy hogs to free-range chickens or whatever? Anyway, I've probably ignored some questions from people out in the audience, but given the time that we're living in, and we have just a few minutes here, I'd like to close out by asking all the panelists, what do they think the pandemic means for sustainability? Are we in such a difficult situation right now, both from an epidemiological public health issue and an economy-wide issue of, we've got nearly 30 million people have just been made unemployed in the blink of an eye. Does sustainability get thrown out the window? Is this more to do with resilience of the food system, or what? Ben, in short answers, because we're going to try to finish shortly.
No, I don't think it gets thrown out. I mentioned that I used the case study of the 80s for farm finances. That was an era where we had lots of compliance that showed up as the bedrock of a lot of our conservation programs on farms now. Does it become challenging? Yes. You start thinking about programs like H2 Ohio, other programs of the metric. What's their viability through all this? And I think it does raise the question, but no, I don't think it throws it out, nor do we lose it. That would be my answer.
Okay, Mark.
I concur. Directly, it's had very little effect, and I don't mean that in a passing way, but very directly on our farms, we have not seen a change, and therefore would not affect sustainability. Indirectly is a different question. You know, the loss of the fuel demand, thus the loss of the ethanol demand, thus the loss of my corn price has really affected me. And so in that respect, I think it remains to be seen how quickly we can recover from this and how this will be played out in the future. It remains to be seen, Ian.
Casey.
I would say that if the current conditions were continued, it would be the kind of change in environment that would show that we cannot keep doing what we had been doing beforehand. We would have to change. I don't expect that to necessarily continue. So I think right now, it's a test of resilience. How quickly can a system adapt and maintain its function under these very different kinds of conditions? If there's a series of these kinds of pandemics, then yeah, we would have to adapt to that as a new normal, and probably there would be big changes in agriculture and food systems as a result. And I guess the final thought I'll throw it is that I think climate change has enough of similar kinds of disruptions, severe enough disruptions, that it could have the effect of maintaining this kind of pressure to make sure that we are able to adapt to unexpected change very quickly.
Great. Well, we've already gone a minute over our regulated time. This has been a fabulous panel to moderate. My job has been really easy, and there were a lot of questions that we were unable to answer, and I apologize to the folks in the audience that we weren't able to answer all your questions. But I hope the panelists will go back into the chat, and if there are any questions in there they think they could answer that we didn't answer this afternoon, I'm sure the folks who asked those questions would appreciate that. So I'd like to thank Ben Brown very much, Mark Drews very much, and Casey Hoy for participating in this panel, and for those of you for asking us questions. And we now have a 10-12 minute break before our final panel. So like Brent earlier, I'm going to give you guys a round of applause, and thank you so much for participating. Thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks again to you. Mark, Ben, nice being with you.